Aesop Elementary School. Meet the author and illustrator. Candace Fleming is a storyteller. She started telling stories before she went to school. Her parents liked her stories. They were happy that she used her imagination. They gave her notebooks to write down the stories. She wrote poems and plays as well. She still has her story notebooks from elementary school. Candace discovered that she loves history too. She thinks history is a lot like storytelling. Both are stories. Stories from history are true. Candace likes writing children's books. She can be both a storyteller and a historian. The principal struggles.
The soon-to-be fourth graders at Aesop Elementary School had a reputation for being precocious, said their former first grade teacher, Ms. Bucky. She ground her teeth. High energy, added their second grade teacher, Mrs. Chen. The muscle beneath her jaw twitched.
Robust,
agreed their third grade teacher, Mr. Frost. He patted his now all-white hair. Humph, snorted Bertha Buns, the lunchroom monitor. Those kids are just plain naughty. Because she wasn't a teacher, Mrs. Buns felt free to speak the truth. Mrs. Buns was right. So special were the incoming fourth graders that no teacher dared set foot in what would soon be their classroom. Not for love or money, shivered Ms. Bucky. Not for all the tea in China, shuddered Mrs. Chen. It was the last day of summer vacation, and Mrs. Struggles, Aesop Elementary's principal, was at her wit's end. School starts tomorrow, and I still don't have a fourth grade teacher, she moaned. What am I going to do? Have you placed a want ad? Suggested Ms. Bucky. Spoken with the superintendent? Suggested Mrs. Chen.
Talked with the school board?
Suggested Mr. Frost. Humph, Mrs. Buns snorted again. Call a zookeeper. Mrs. Struggles ignored the remark. Defeated, she shuffled into her office and flopped into her chair. If Aesop Elementary were bigger, she thought, I would have separated the troublemakers long ago. But the school was small, only one classroom per grade level, so the kids had to stay together. Rubbing her throbbing temples, she sighed. Oh, I wish a teacher would walk through that door. At that precise moment, a breeze blew through the principal's office. It rustled the papers on her desk, rattled her window blinds, and flung open the door to reveal a tall, dark man wearing a pith helmet and clutching a copy of the morning's want ads.
I am MrJupiter,
he said.
I have come about the teaching job.
Mrs. Struggles rubbed her eyes. Was this a dream? She wondered. But no, MrJupiter was still there.
You are looking for a fourth grade teacher, aren't you?
He asked. Mrs. Struggles nodded, her spirits suddenly soaring. Waving MrJupiter into a seat, she said, Tell me a bit about yourself.
Where to begin?
He replied.
My first job was as an assistant dog groomer aboard King Bernard's yacht, the SS Pooch, anchored off the Dalmatian coast. After receiving my degree in nanothermal economics from Dummer University, I led an expedition in search of the dodo bird. Later, I conducted the Timbuktu Philharmonic Orchestra, worked as a translator for Bigfoot, became the first man to ski down Mount Everest, collected mummified cats in Egypt, and discovered the lost city of Atlantis.
He smiled.
Among other things.
Mrs. Struggles tapped her desk with a pencil. He certainly sounded interesting. Do you have any teaching experience? She asked.
Some,
replied MrJupiter.
I was head tetherball coach at Matilda Jane's School for Prim and Proper Girls in Las Vegas, as well as the swimming instructor at Loch Ness Middle School. I also taught Swahili as a second language at Dougalhorn Elementary in Switzerland, hula dancing at Balderdash Academy for Boys in London, and organic geochemistry at Harvard.
He smiled again.
Among other places.
Mrs. Struggles tapped her desk some more. He sounded experienced, but have you worked with high-energy students?
I studied for a year at the Coochie Coochie Institute for Misbehaved Monkeys,
said MrJupiter. He smiled a third time.
Among other schools.
Mrs. Struggles kept tapping. Is there anything else you'd like to add? She finally asked. MrJupiter shook his head.
Nothing important,
he said.
Although you might be interested to know I attended 5th grade at this very school.
Mrs. Struggles stopped tapping. You did? She exclaimed. Really? Who was your teacher? Her question caused MrJupiter to turn as white as his whale tooth necklace. But Mrs. Struggles didn't notice. Leaping to her feet, she cried, Why didn't you tell me this earlier? She extended her hand. You're hired. Welcome back to Aesop Elementary, MrJupiter.
An absent-minded morning.
On the second day of school, MrJupiter took attendance.
Raise your hand if you're not here,
he said. The children looked at one another. Then Jackie's hand shot into the air. I'm not here, she snickered. I've gone to the National Tetherball Tournament to see the Hoboken Blowfish take on the Altoona Poodles. The other students giggled, but MrJupiter calmly said,
A reasonable excuse.
He wrote Jackie's name on the attendance slip. Then he asked,
Is anyone else absent?
Me, said Bruce. I'm staying home to play Meteor Monsters. Yeah, added Lenny, and I'm staying with him. After all, the two-player version is the best.
Perfectly understandable,
said MrJupiter. He wrote their names down, too. I couldn't come to school today either, said Victoria. I'm having a facial.
I see,
said MrJupiter. And I couldn't come because I'm watching cartoons, said Emberly.
Of course,
said MrJupiter. And I couldn't come because I ate too many hot dogs and got a stomach ache, said Ham.
My sympathies,
said MrJupiter. Melvin waved his hand in the air. Ask me why I'm not here, he cried. The others ignored him. Ask me, cried Kelvin.
Why aren't you here?
Asked MrJupiter. Because I don't like school, replied Kelvin. Hey, hollered Lenny. That's why I'm not here. Get serious, snorted Stanford. You already said you were playing video games with Bruce. For your information, Mr. Know-It-All Smarty Pants, I'm absent because I'm playing video games with Bruce and because I don't like school.
That's too bad,
said MrJupiter. He wrote all their names on his attendance slip.
Is anyone else absent?
We are, cried Ashley A and Ashley B. And me, added Ashley Z. And me, repeated Humphrey. MrJupiter took down their names. Then he pointed at Rose.
Are you here?
No, answered Rose. I overslept.
What about you?
MrJupiter asked Missy. Missy shook her head. I got lost on the way to school.
And you?
MrJupiter looked at Rachel. said Rachel.
Beg your pardon?
Said MrJupiter. Rachel said again.
I'm sorry?
Said MrJupiter.
What?
Said Rachel. MrJupiter shrugged and added her name to the slip. I'm not here either, Bernadette said with a dramatic sigh. I just wasn't in the mood. Hey, cried Lenny. That's why I'm not here. Because I wasn't in the mood, and I don't like school, and I'm playing video games with Bruce. Stanford snorted. Get serious. Lenny smirked. Get lost. He wrote the last of the names on his attendance slip. Then he looked around the classroom.
Isn't anyone here today?
Lenny shook his head. It looks like you're all by yourself.
Actually,
said MrJupiter.
I'm not here either.
You're not? Said Bernadette.
No,
said MrJupiter.
I'm trekking through the Amazon rainforest in search of the rare and elusive golden-throated rat squirrel. But don't worry, I have a substitute.
He plopped a human skull onto his desk. The children stared wide-eyed.
This is Mrs. Yorick.
MrJupiter explained.
I found her on an archaeological dig along the Solo River in Java.
The children kept staring.
Mrs. Yorick,
continued MrJupiter,
is never absent. Can you guess why?
The children shook their heads.
Because,
he said,
she doesn't have any body to go out with.
For one moment, the children sat in silence. Then Kelvin chuckled. Victoria giggled. Soon all the children were rocking with laughter. No body, howled Lenny. That's a good one, MrJupiter.
Thank you, Leonard,
said MrJupiter.
I thought it was pretty funny myself.
And he laughed until his sides ached and his eyes teared. Then they all got down to work. Moral: he laughs best Who laughs last?
Kelvin goes to kindergarten.
It was math time in Mr. Jupiter's class.
All right, students.
Said Mr. Jupiter.
You have 2 minutes to do your multiplication tests.
He flipped over his hourglass.
Made from the sands of the Sahara Desert.
He explained.
Ready, set, go.
The fourth graders attacked their papers. Most of them were already up to 16s and 17s. Emberly was on the 29s. Stanford was on the 34s. Kelvin Tallywong was still on the 3s. Kelvin looked down at his test paper and started writing the answers. 3 times 1 equals 3. That was easy enough. 3 times 2 equals 6. That wasn't bad either. But what about 3 times 7, or 3 times 9, or 3 times 12? Kelvin stuck his pencil in his mouth and gnawed at the eraser. He knew he shouldn't. He knew he was going to need that eraser very soon, but he couldn't help it. When he was nervous, he chewed, and multiplication made him very nervous. 3 times 3 equals, 9? Yes, definitely. Probably. Maybe 9. 3 times 4 equals 14? No, that didn't look right. He tried to erase the answer, but ended up with a gooey, wet smear. Kelvin sighed. Even if he'd managed to learn the 3s, there were still the 4s to struggle through, and the 7s, and the 9s, and the numbers stretched to infinity. Kelvin felt the weight of all those numbers pressing down on him. It felt like the weight of the world.
Time.
Called Mr. Jupiter.
Pass your tests forward, please.
Across the room, Kelvin's best friend, Humphrey, punched his fist into the air. Kelvin knew Humphrey had passed his 14s. Behind him, Stanford raised his hand. Mr. Jupiter, he said, I think I passed my 34s. May I stay after school and do my 35s and 36s? Show off, muttered Kelvin under his breath. He chewed and swallowed more of his eraser. Then he laid his head on his desk. Why do I have to be in 4th grade? He moaned softly to himself. It's too hard.
Did you say something, Kelvin?
Asked Mr. Jupiter. Kelvin looked up and shook his head. But to himself he said, I wish I was in kindergarten again, where school was fun and easy. Zzz, crack! The loudspeaker buzzed and crackled. Then Mrs. Shorthand's disembodied voice filled the room. Mr. Jupiter, come in, Mr. Jupiter. The class giggled. Before becoming the school secretary, Mrs. Shorthand had been an air traffic controller.
I read you loud and clear, Mrs. Shorthand,
said Mr. Jupiter.
Go ahead.
Miss Fairchild needs a student helper in her kindergarten class on the double. Do you roger that?
Aye, Roger,
replied Mr. Jupiter.
Help is on the way.
Zzz, crack. The loudspeaker buzzed and crackled off. Mr. Jupiter looked out across his classroom.
Who would like to be a student helper this morning?
Me, said Jackie. Me, repeated Humphrey. Ooh, grunted Ham. He stretched his hand toward the ceiling. Ooh, ooh. MrJupiter looked past the boys. His gaze fell on Kelvin, who was still resting his head and gnawing on his eraser.
Calvin, you may go to the kindergarten room. The rest of you, please take out your arithmetic books and turn to page 1026.
Kelvin took the pencil out of his mouth and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He walked down the hall to the kindergarten room. The kindergartners were sitting on the carpet when he arrived. They turned to stare at him as he stepped through the door. I'm Kelvin, said Kelvin. Of course you are, chirped Miss Fairchild. A wide, white-toothed smile spread across her cheeks as she turned to her students and clapped her hands. Class, let's sing hello to Kelvin. 17 kindergartners burst into song. Hello, hello, and how are you? We like you, and we hope you like us too. Kelvin's cheeks turned pink. I'm your helper, he explained. And such a big helper too, said Miss Fairchild. I bet you're the biggest kindergartner in the whole school. No, stammered Kelvin. I'm a fourth grader. Oh, you silly Billy, said Miss Fairchild. Class, isn't Kelvin a silly Billy? Yes, chimed the class. They all smiled at him. Kelvin suddenly felt very confused and very nervous. He pulled out his pencil and chewed on the eraser. Oh dear, said Miss Fairchild. Boys and girls, can you tell Kelvin our rule about pencils? No chewing, they chimed. Miss Fairchild beamed. That's right. Chewing is for beavers. Now, put your pencil away and come sit down. For a second, Kelvin stood there, uncertain. Then he shrugged. Circle time beat math time anytime. Sticking the pencil back in his pocket, he moved toward the carpet. Wait! Shrieked a little girl. That boy isn't wearing a bus. A yellow construction paper bus hung from a string around her neck. It read, Emily. He can't sit down if he's not wearing a bus. Yeah, said a boy whose bus identified him as Mikey. He has to have a bus. That's okay, said Kelvin. I don't need a bus. Yes, you do, said Mikey. That's the rule. Mikey's right, Kelvin, chirped Miss Fairchild. All kindergartners wear buses. But I'm a fourth grader, said Kelvin. Miss Fairchild didn't hear. She was too busy cutting a school bus out of yellow construction paper. There! Now all this bus needs is a name. Can you spell your name? Of course I can, said Kelvin indignantly. What letter does it start with? Asked Miss Fairchild. C, said Kelvin. C! Exclaimed Miss Fairchild. What a wonderful letter! Class, can you make the sound of the letter C? Like a flock of crows, the kindergartners cried, Caw, caw, caw! Kelvin felt his cheeks grow even hotter. Miss Fairchild clapped her hands. Very good, she gushed. She wrote a big letter C on Kelvin's school bus, then asked, "Do you know what letter comes next? Sound it out if you need to." "A," answered Kelvin. "The next letter is A, followed by an L and a V and an I and an N. Kelvin." Miss Fairchild beamed again. "Did you hear that, class? Kelvin has learned to spell his name. Let's give him 3 cheers. Ready? Hip, hip, hooray!" chimed the kindergartners. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Multiplication tables, thought Kelvin, were starting to look good. Miss Fairchild wrote the rest of Kelvin's name on the bus, then tied a piece of yarn to it and draped it around his neck. "Now you may sit," she said. He found a spot between a boy whose bus said Riley and a girl whose bus said Sydney. "Miss Fairchild," whined Mikey, "the new boy isn't using pretzel legs. He has to use pretzel legs. That's the rule." "Mikey's right, Kelvin," said Miss Fairchild. "All kindergartners use pretzel legs." "But I'm a 4th grader," Kelvin said again. Miss Fairchild didn't hear. She was too busy opening a big book and setting it on the easel. Kelvin tucked up his legs and followed along as the class read Chicka Chicka Boom Boom. Kelvin already knew the story, so it was easy. Next, they recited the days of the week. That was easy too. Even math time was easy. 1 cookie plus 1 cookie equals how many cookies, class? Asked Miss Fairchild. The kindergartners were puzzled, but not Kelvin. 2, he cried. 2 cookies. Very good, gushed Miss Fairchild. Kelvin grinned. Math should always be this easy. School should always be this easy. Then Miss Fairchild clapped her hands again. Boys and girls, let's end circle time with something special. The Squirrel Dance. 17 eager kindergartners leaped to their feet. Wrinkling their noses and wiggling their bottoms, they chanted, gray squirrel, swish your bushy tail. Gray squirrel, swish your bushy tail. Wrinkle up your little nose, hold a nut between your toes. Gray squirrel, swish your bushy tail. Suddenly, Mikey pointed an accusing finger. Miss Fairchild, he whined. Kelvin didn't swish his bushy tail. He has to swish his bushy tail. That's the rule. All eyes fell on Kelvin. But I'm too big to swish, said Kelvin. I'm in 4th grade. Miss Fairchild didn't hear. In kindergarten, everyone swishes, she chirped. Come on, let's see your swish. Kelvin shook his head. Like this, said Miss Fairchild. See? No, said Kelvin. Don't be shy, coaxed Miss Fairchild. Just swish. Swish, whined Mikey. Swish, shrieked Emily. Swish, 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 chimed the rest of the class. We're not leaving the carpet until you do. chirped Miss Fairchild. She smiled encouragingly, and Kelvin gave in. I hope Humphrey never finds out about this, he thought, as he wiggled his hips and wrinkled his nose and pretended to hold a nut. I hope he never knows I swished my bushy tail. Thinking about Humphrey made Kelvin wonder what the rest of his class was doing. Were they reviewing the times tables, learning fractions, doing advanced calculus? Kelvin was pretty sure they weren't reciting the days of the week or doing the squirrel dance. Maybe, thought Kelvin, kindergarten's a little too easy. Maybe... Miss Fairchild clapped, interrupting his thoughts. Snack time, she said. Everyone take a seat at the tables. Snack time? All thoughts of fourth grade vanished as Kelvin headed for the table. Avoiding the swish-demanding Mikey, he took a seat between a boy with a buzz cut whose school bag read Victor and a girl holding a beanbag platypus. Her school bag said Alicia. Victor turned and stared at Kelvin. Kelvin stared back. Miss Fairchild sang out, Who wants a yummy cheese stick and a box of raisins? She passed out the snack. Peck, 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 peck. On his other side, Alicia made her beanbag platypus waddle across the table. It attacked Kelvin's napkin with its little plastic bill. It lunged at his cheese stick. It nipped at his raisin box. Here was something else that never happened in fourth grade. The platypus whirled on Emily, sitting only a few seats away. Peck, 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 peck. It bit Emily's hand. Emily started to cry. Miss Fairchild rushed over. Where are our table manners, children? She asked. Alicia, no pecking. Pecking is for woodpeckers. And Emily? She patted the sobbing girl's back. There, it's not a real bill. And the girl sitting across from Kelvin went berserk. I want to go home. I want my mommy. Mommy, chanted the rest of the class. Next to Kelvin, Victor calmly transferred his finger to the other nostril. Help, thought Kelvin. I'm trapped in kindergarten. He imagined the peace and tranquility of his fourth grade classroom. Everyone sitting quietly at their desk, memorizing their multiplication tables. It was a beautiful thought. I wish I was in the fourth grade again, whispered Kelvin. Zzz, crack. Miss Fairchild, come in, Miss Fairchild. Can you send Kelvin Tallywong to the fourth grade, please? Over and out. Kelvin didn't hesitate. He ripped off his school bus and ran for the door. Down the hall, toward his own classroom. He was ready to tackle the threes, the fours, the multiplication tables into infinity. Nothing was too hard. No siree. Excitedly, Kelvin burst through the door, then skittered to a stop. What was going on? Why was the whole class standing and wrinkling their noses and wiggling their bottoms? Humphrey waved. Hey, Kelvin, you're just in time. Look what MrJupiter taught us. And as Kelvin stood, open-mouthed, his classmates chanted, "Gray squirrel, swish your bushy tail." Moral: be careful what you wish for. It might come true.
Discuss. 1. Give an example of a major and a minor character in this story. 2. Can you put yourself in Calvin's place? Have you ever wanted to go back to kindergarten?